Hey everyone, thanks for checking out this next part of my 2017 Year in Review retrospective. This time I am covering the multi-platform games. So this is the first time I'm doing a multi-platform episode. It always seems like a much bigger undertaking, but I'm glad to finally do one. I've finished off the 3 major consoles so far, so this is filling up the gaps for those 3 really. After this, I'm going to get to the 3DS and Vita, and that'll finish off this year's retrospectives, and I can get back to my usual retrospectives. If you haven't seen any of my previous retrospectives, I basically go through a system, or in this case, a year in release order. So in the order that this stuff came out, and I decide what I want to keep in my collection, what I should check out that I didn't pick up. And I've just been making these videos to kind of showcase that to people and give them an idea of some of the stuff that came out that they might not really know about. So I've gotten a lot of great feedback there. I really appreciate it. If you like this video, to subscribe and share with your friends. And let's get right into it. The first notable game of the year is Fate Extella: The Umbral Star. This is really a game only for hardcore fans of the Fate series, but because that series has such a big following, I had to include it. This is an action game based on the Fate series. It follows the story from Fate Extra, which was a PSP game, and it takes place in that universe, which is separate from some of the other Fate universes. So I know that stuff is pretty complex, but again, just really for Fate fans. So the first very big release of the year is Resident Evil 7. Now, this is the gold edition that came out much later. I think this came out in December. It includes most of the DLC. It doesn't include the Not a Hero DLC on disc, but it does include the End of Zoe, which is a great kind of epilogue to the game. A real fun extra chapter worth checking out. So Resident Evil is one of my favorite franchises. It has its ups and downs, but for the most part, I really enjoy most of the games. 6 was a pretty bad game. I mean, I ended up enjoying some of the scenarios by the end, but you really had to be able to get past some of the bad design decisions to enjoy it, and they had said that that was going to be the direction moving forward. Right before 6 came out, the director came out and said, hey, don't expect good survival horror from this series anymore. This is an action series. So we expect games like 5 and 6 to be the trend moving forward. And then I guess 6 sold really badly because they went ahead and they rechanged everything. They reinvented the series. It is now a first-person stealth-based series. Well, it kind of starts that way, but eventually this game does get way more like a traditional Resident Evil. It's all about finding ammo and healing items and managing your inventory that way and kind of taking out monsters the traditional way. It's just from a first-person perspective. The setting is also very different. Instead of your traditional Umbrella outbreak, now you don't really know what's going on. You're trapped in this hillbilly family's house looking for your lost girlfriend and just gotta figure stuff out. So it's a really cool new story. It's a really cool new system of gameplay. Everything about this game is great. I highly recommend it. I don't think it sold well at all, which is really unfortunate because this is one of the games, this is one of the games of the year. This really deserves way more attention than it did get. So if you're into horror, this is a must play. Next up is For Honor, which came out on the PS4 and the Xbox One. This is Ubisoft's multiplayer combat game, which was really popular for a hot minute. The game was a third-person action game where players could choose different factions, including the Knights, Samurai, and Vikings, and they went head-to-head in team battles against the other factions online. The game features a single-player campaign where you play with AI-controlled partners, but really the multiplayer was what this game was designed for. I haven't really heard much about the game since launch, but Ubisoft is still supporting it because I saw something about Season 5 content coming out soon, so I hope this game is doing well. It was really cool for a bit, I just think it died down pretty quickly. Next up, the first of many Kickstarter games to get a console release this year. This is Torment: Tides of Numura, which was available on the PS4 and Xbox One. This game is the spiritual successor to the PC cult hit Planescape Torment, which was a D&D game that had a ton of critical praise. Like the original game, Torment is a Diablo-style RPG, but with a heavy emphasis on storytelling and character dialogue. This Torment takes place in a futuristic world that's fallen back to the medieval area, with old technology still lying around. The main character is the vessel for a man from the old world who's being tracked down by an enemy who wants them dead. So I don't want to go too much into the story, but that's the main reason to play this game. It is a fun RPG, but what makes it stand out from a lot of the other Diablo clones is just how deep the story is, how intricate the narrative is, and just what a good job they do telling that story. If you're a fan of RPGs or you're a fan of narrative games, I highly recommend it. The first LEGO game of the year is LEGO Worlds, which was released on PS4, Xbox One, and the Switch. Now, LEGO Worlds is an interesting mix of the standard LEGO game with inspiration from Minecraft. The game doesn't feature a specific franchise like the most recent popular LEGO games, but it uses a more generic LEGO setting, where the players can find and collect different blocks and then use them to build stuff. You can also manipulate the landscape, build pre-designed structures, or just build completely custom pieces to create your world. Right after that, Ubisoft puts out another multiplayer game, though this one's a little more focused on co-op, Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon Wildlands, which was available for the PS4 and Xbox One. This is the latest game in the Ghost Recon series and is a pretty big departure from the previous entries. It's an open world game more like The Division, and it uses a more modern setting like the original Ghost Recon games. The game features a huge open world with day and night and a ton of side missions. The player can drive a number of vehicles and control drones, and the campaign can be played single player or online with 4-player co-op, which is kind of the way it was meant to be played. More recently, this game is getting a lot more press because they've just added missions that you can play for a limited time that star the Predator. So the next game on the list, and the first of many disappointing games, Mass Effect Andromeda, which was released on the PS4 and the Xbox One. Now, I'm going to go through a lot of bad games as I go through this. Some of them are really notable just because of the franchise or because of what ended up happening to them. But even though they're not great games and maybe you shouldn't play them, I still think they're worth mentioning so people can learn about this stuff. So Mass Effect Andromeda was the follow-up to the original Mass Effect trilogy, which just has a ton of love. It's such a great trilogy. I mean, it has hit and miss pieces, but for the most part, like Mass Effect 2 is considered one of the best games ever, and I think that it's deserved. And Mass Effect, you really have to do a bad job to mess that up, and they did. They messed it up in every conceivable way. The combat here is actually really good, and that's the one good part of the game, is that the combat has been upgraded a bit and feels really good. The problems with the game, though, are well beyond that. First of all, there are more bugs than maybe any other game I've ever played. I hate buggy games. I didn't play Fallout 4 for a long time because of that, and this is probably worse. It's insane how rushed this game must have been, because it breaks all over the place. On top of that, the stuff that Mass Effect is really known for, the writing and dialogue, are really bad here. You'll notice pretty quickly that the writing takes a dive. The dialogue is really poorly written. It really feels out of place. It doesn't flow nicely. Even if you're the most hardcore Mass Effect fan, I would say completely ignore this game. The story itself features a character who arrives in a galaxy far away from the original trilogy and is supposed to explore and set up base there and meet a whole bunch of other races that have already left. When they get there, they get attacked by aliens. The other races that were supposed to be there, some of them didn't show up. Everything's in kind of disarray, and you kind of have to figure out what's going on. It's unclear if this was supposed to be the beginning of a new trilogy or not, but basically because of how bad it performed, the franchise is kind of dead or on hiatus. There's no plans for a Mass Effect 5 at this point, and that's sad, because this game probably could have been good if they gave it another year of development and had some script rewrites. The next game is one I was really excited about. Another Kickstarter game, Dreamfall Chapters. This is the follow-up to the original Longest Journey PC adventure game and the sequel Dreamfall, which was released on Xbox and PC and is a great adventure series. Just one of the last big hurrahs for the adventure genre. This follows up on the cliffhanger from the end of Dreamfall, and it's just great to be back in this world. I believe this is the original cut of the game, so that's kind of a shame. I know the PC version had a ton of updates after this came out, so still great to have on consoles, although it would have been nicer if they held off for a little bit more and got the more complete edition out on consoles. The original game was released in 5 episodes, and once those 5 were complete, then they put it out on consoles. I think you have to order it through a specialty retailer. I got mine through Amazon, but I don't think you can just walk into a game store and get it. So if you're interested in it, check out online to see where you can get it. If you don't know the series, it takes place in 2 split worlds. One fantasy realm where magic rules, but they have no science, and a futuristic world where technology reigns, but there's no magic. And there's kind of an evil corporation that runs things behind the scenes in both worlds, and you play one of 2 kind of travelers who go between worlds and get caught up in that storyline. Next up is Lego City Undercover, which was released for PS4, Xbox One, and Switch. So Lego City Undercover was a great Wii U exclusive for a long time. It was a Lego game with an original theme and a fun and interesting take on an open world GTA style game, and it finally came out to every console this year, so you can check that out now if you didn't have a Wii U. Following that, we get Bulletstorm Full Clip Edition, which came out on the PS4 and Xbox One. Now, this is an update of last gen's first-person shooter that sold itself on raunchy dialogue and stylish kills, and it gets the remaster treatment that I don't think anyone was asking for, to be honest. That original game was cool for a minute and then completely forgotten. In fact, I think they were trying to give that thing away. You could get that game for dirt cheap shortly after launch, and that makes it hard to swallow when this thing comes out at full price. I think it's a wasted opportunity. If this thing had came out at a budget price and included the DLC, definitely would be something worth checking out, but unfortunately it wasn't. And speaking of DLC, that's the other kind of shame here, is that the one really interesting addition to the game is that you can play through the game as Duke Nukem. So, I mean, that's kind of a neat feature. The problem is that was DLC and you had to pay extra for it. So a lost opportunity here to bring back a game that was kind of liked, but didn't really have a good chance. Following that, we get Yooka-Laylee, which came out for PS4 and Xbox One in April, but the Switch version is coming out sometime this year. This is the spiritual successor to Nintendo 64's Banjo-Kazooie. It was kickstarted by a group of ex-Rare employees, and they wanted to recreate the feeling of an N64-style platformer, and that's kind of what they did. So a lot of the complaints are that that design doesn't really hold up anymore, and it's not really fun anymore. So if you really want to go back to N64 platformers, this is an interesting new one, but for modern platformer fans, it doesn't really hold up. The game has the players control the chameleon Yuka and the bat Laylee, who are trying to get back a valuable magical book that they found and lost. You explore a factory trying to get back all the pages from the book and take out different enemies, and it's just kind of a traditional platformer. Next up, a game that really brought an old genre to light, Stardew Valley, which came out on the PS4 and Xbox One. This was an indie farming game that really took the world by storm last year digitally. The farming slow life genre was pretty much relegated to Harvest Moon and its spin-offs, and not a lot of people cared about that series. So it's amazing that one indie developer can come out and just reinvent that wheel. It's basically the same core concepts, but it's just everything is different, everything is better. There's a ton of extra stuff in there. It's a really interesting world. There's a great upgrade system and some fun romance options. So it's just a great one of those games, probably the best one of those games. So highly worth checking out. If you've never played any of those Harvest Moon games, try this one, because I think it's a lot more accessible and just a lot funner. Next up is the Outlast trilogy, which came out for PS4 and Xbox One. So this is a combination of 3 games, the old Outlast 1 and the Whistleblower expansion for that game, plus the new Outlast 2. So all the Outlast games are stealth-based first-person horror games where you sneak around and avoid enemies using a night vision camera to help you see in the dark. This game takes place in a completely different environment and a whole new story. It stars a journalist and his wife who end up in a village populated by a crazy cult who are trying to take them out. You have a new camera in this one that just works better than the old one. It's got some focus options and it lets you track noise too. Overall, I hear different reports about whether this game is better or worse than the original. I think it depends on who you ask. I know there's some frustrating parts that kind of drag the game down, but overall, just another interesting entry in the stealth horror genre. Next up, we get Siberia 3, which came out for PS4 and Xbox One, and I think a Switch version is planned for this year. This game is really notable just because it's coming out so long after the release of Siberia 2, and Siberia 1 and 2 were point-and-click adventure games that had a small following. They are interesting games, but I don't know if there was really enough to keep the franchise moving forward. Siberia 2 had some minor plot lines that they picked up on this one, so the game stars Kate Walker, just like the previous two. In this one, now that she's done her kind of main journey, she is helping a tribe of Ukels during their migration, and it follows up on some of the storylines about her old boss trying to track her down and bring her back to the US. There's some interesting parts. I don't think it really holds up in today's climate for adventure games, but if you're a big fan of those previous 2 games, it's definitely something you want to check out. Next up is Puyo Tetris, which came out on the PS4 and the Switch. This was a mashup of the 2 big puzzle franchises, and it does some really interesting things to mix up those puzzle games. You can play both the standard version of Tetris or Puyo, or you can play a new combination mode which kind of has you using both pieces at the same time, along with a new rule set for how those pieces work together. It's an interesting new experience. It's great to have both these games together. It's fun to have it on the Switch personally, I find, so definitely worth checking out if you're into those puzzle games. Next up for PS4 and Xbox One is Prey. Now, this game is a bit misleading because it has nothing to do with the previous Prey or the cancelled Prey 2. I really don't think they should have used that name. It is a completely different game, but it's a really cool game on its own. It takes inspiration from some very different places than the original Prey. The developer are the same people who made Dishonored and Bioshock 2, and those are the games it takes its inspiration from. The game is a sci-fi first-person shooter with some interesting mechanics. It has a open-world space station that the player explores similar to Bioshock, with new areas opening up as the player progresses. It also features RPG-like systems and stealth play systems, so that changes it up quite a bit from just being a traditional first-person shooter. The game stars the main character Morgan, who's trapped in a space station that was studying a hostile alien race when they break containment and come after him. Basically, you have to just survive and escape the station. So overall, a game that didn't get discussed too much after release, but definitely worth checking out just because it does some really interesting things with the first-person genre. Next up is Injustice 2, which is the follow-up to Injustice Gods Among Us, which is basically what you'd expect from a sequel. If you don't know, Injustice is a fighting game by the Mortal Kombat developers that stars DC characters. It's kind of like a follow-up to DC vs. Mortal Kombat. It is a really interesting fighting game and a real fun one. It's got a really great story mode, which is what stands out so much. So definitely the best fighting game story mode this year. If you love DC characters, it's definitely something you want to check out. It's a great follow-up to the original Injustice. Gameplay is pretty similar to the previous Injustice game. It does use that Mortal Kombat style fighting system, which is pretty good. The game introduces a couple new features, including the gear system, which is a loot box driven system designed around the idea of RPG-like progression in a fighting game. It is not intrusive like a lot of the other loot box systems we'll get into later. This was a bit early for that, but it's an interesting way to kind of add progression to a fighting game and really extend that single player experience for people who want a bit more out of their fighting games. The game has base stats for each character that increase as you level up, and you can also increase them by equipping different kinds of gear, which also change the look of your character. The base game included 29 characters, and 13 additional characters were released later. It also featured a new multiverse mode, which is a series of fights with different conditions and handicaps. That's just another way to extend that single player experience. It also has all the online modes that you would expect from a fighting game. Definitely great for people who are looking to be a bit more competitive with it. Next up is the physical release of Friday the 13th, the game, which came out for PS4 and Xbox One, and I don't know why they bothered to put this out physically. The game itself was a really interesting team-based survival multiplayer game that was kickstarted, and despite many of the issues it found a pretty big audience just because of how fun and interesting it was. In the game, a group of players go up against Jason and try to survive or escape. There's multiple ways to survive or escape. Jason is super hard to kill, but it is possible. There is supposed to be a single-player campaign coming to the game, but it hasn't been released yet, and so I don't know why they didn't wait until that was out to put this out physically. Next up is Rime, which came out for the PS4, Xbox One, and Switch. This is a third-person adventure game in which the player controls a boy exploring an island after a shipwreck, and features 5 large stages for the player to explore and solve puzzles in. Overall, the game suffers from some design issues, but the island is a great and interesting environment, and it's worth checking out for players who like slower exploration games. Next up is maybe the biggest fighting game of the year, and there's been a lot of fighting games this year, Tekken 7, which was released on the PS4 and the Xbox One. This is the Tekken release that finally brought some attention back to the series for casual gamers. Every game in the series has been pretty solid, but I don't think it's done a good job at bringing back casual players for quite a while, and this really seems to be doing it. The game features 2 new gameplay mechanics, the Rage Art super move and the Power Crush, which lets you take hits while continuing your attacks. There is a new cinematic story mode and character customization mode, as well as all the expected multiplayer and practice modes. Unfortunately, there were no kind of crazy modes that Tekken is known for included at launch, but you can get bowling through DLC. The game is continuing to get a bunch of good press for its special characters. It started with Akuma, who was just really surprised players that you could work a Street Fighter character into a Tekken game, and it worked pretty well. And now they're bringing out things like Geese Howard from the King of Fighters series and Noctis from Final Fantasy 15, so we'll see what else they do. Overall, if you've enjoyed Tekken in the past but haven't really gone back in a while, this is the time to go back. Following that, we got Super Beat Sonic, which came out for the PS4 and the Switch this year. The game was previously released on the Vita, but this is the EX edition. So this is a spiritual follow-up to the DJ Max series, which was big on the PSP. It is a rhythm game where you tap along with the rhythm, but I think this game really relies on touch controls. That made the Vita version really great. The PS4 version obviously doesn't have touch controls, and the Switch version had broken touch controls at launch. They worked, but not well, and so those were supposed to be patched. I don't know if they have been patched yet. If they have, it's definitely worth checking out on the Switch over the PS4, but overall I think the Vita version is still the best version of this game. Next up is Dead by Daylight, which was launched on the PS4 and the Xbox One. And despite launching before Friday the 13th and being pretty similar, I don't think it had nearly as much press. The game is a survival multiplayer game where a group of players go up against the serial killer and you have to fix generators to escape the level. Basically the objective. There are different levels and different killers, which mixes things up quite a bit. And what is really cool is all the DLC you can get for this game that let you use kind of exclusive characters. So you can get DLC that's themed after Saw, Halloween, Nightmare on Elm Street, just a bunch of different franchises. So it's hard to know if this or Friday the 13th is better, but if you dig one, it's definitely worth checking out the other. Following that is Elite Dangerous, which came out for PS4 and the Xbox One. Now this is the massive online space adventure from PC, finally coming to consoles. This game is comparable to a space MMO like EVE Online. It's got trading, mining, combat, and just a ton of missions to take on in a massive universe. I can't really do the game justice because it is an MMO that takes a lot of time to figure out. It's got incredibly deep systems. I do think it's a little more accessible than EVE is, but that said, what makes this one a little more interesting, there's an option to play single player mode. You still have to be online and connected to kind of the whole universe, but you just are playing alone. So you can't get your cargo killed or stolen by other players in all those ways that EVE manages to really turn off a lot of new players. Next up for PS4 and Xbox One is Valkyria Revolution. Now, this is kind of the spin-off sequel to the Valkyria Chronicles games. It's a little bit of a shame because it is not the kind of game I think anyone was asking for. Luckily, we did just get Valkyria Chronicles 4 announced, which is a traditional Valkyria game, so I look forward to that. In the meantime, this is an action RPG set in the Valkyria Chronicles world, so it does try to use some of the tactics gameplay from the previous game. It really feels different. It is great to have another game in that world. If this led to them making Valkyria Chronicles 4, then I'm all for it. It is still fun and worth checking out for hardcore fans of the Valkyria Chronicles series, just don't expect it to be like those games. Next up for PS4 and Xbox One, I don't think they had a 3DS release, but the original did, so I might be wrong. This is the Mega Man Legacy Collection 2, so not quite as much on here as I would have hoped for, but I'm still happy to have the Mega Man games coming out for modern consoles. This game collects Mega Man 7 for the SNES, 8 for the PlayStation, and 9 and 10. So that's kind of the big deal for me, is that 9 and 10 are on here. They've never been released physically, and I really do like these games, so I want physical copies of them. Like the original Legacy Collection, it's got all the bonuses from that, so gallery mode and challenge mode. Unfortunately, I wish they had done a little more with it. It would have been nice to have some of the extra games that came with the original Mega Man Anniversary Collection. It also would have been nice to have the Saturn version of Mega Man 8, which is the superior version, which extra bosses. But, like I said, I'll take what I can get when it comes to Mega Man. Following that, another fighting game, this one a collection of old fighting games. This is Naruto Shippuden Ultimate Ninja Storm Legacy. So this was released for PS4 and Xbox One and is a collection of last-gen fighting games. So came with Ultimate Storm 1, 2, and 3 and Ultimate Ninja Storm 4 Road to Boruto. Basically got the fighting game series that covers the entire span of the Naruto series, both the original series and Shippuden. This is pretty typical anime-style fighters, so if you're not into that, you won't dig it. It's something that I don't think is really worth having on their own. They're fun games, but not great, but being packaged up like this really makes it worthwhile in my opinion. Next up is Ark Survival Evolved. So this is an interesting craft survival game with a neat setting that's unfortunately hampered by a ton of grindings and pretty difficult gameplay. The game drops the player onto a huge island that's filled with tons of hazards, including 60 species of dinosaurs, some of which can be tamed. The player has to build up their base and survive the difficult environment. It's not a game I'd recommend to everyone, but if you love crafting survival games and you don't mind a grindy and hard game, this is something you probably want to check out just for the setting. Next up was Cinemora EX, which came out for, I believe, Xbox One, PS4, and the Switch. This is a horizontal side-scrolling shoot-'em-up which was originally released as a digital game last gen, but it got a cult following because of its gameplay and interesting dark storyline, which takes its cast of basically furries and gives them some pretty serious backstories. The gameplay features a time-based system where you don't have health, but you lose time as you get damaged, and you earn time for defeating enemies, and the goal of each level is just to complete it within the time limit. Following that, another kind of disappointing game, Agents of Mayhem, released for the PS4 and Xbox One. Sadly, this is kind of a follow-up to Saints Row 4. It's a strange new spin-off IP of the Saints franchise, but it doesn't really do anything to stand on its own. It doesn't really feel fully fleshed out as a game. The missions are boring. Everything else is not quite as good as a Saints game, not nearly as interesting. So that's a bit of a shame. Like Saints Row, it's an open-world, mission-based third-person shooter with mostly new characters, but again, it doesn't have many new ideas to help it stand out. Next up is Cities Skylines, which came out for PS4 and Xbox One. After the fiasco that was SimCity 4, it's great to have another city-building sim come and breathe some new life into the genre, especially on consoles. This game is your typical city-building game, but it's got some really deep systems, and it's just a great game for people who love those SimCity games. Next up is this gen's version of the first Resident Evil Revelations, which came out on Xbox One and PS4, and much later came out on the Switch as a kind of Resident Evil Revelations collection, even though only the first game is on the cart and you have to download the second game. So this is the first kind of well-regarded spin-off to Resident Evil. It's an update of the original 3DS game, which was also released on last-gen consoles, and this is just the latest-gen version of it. If you haven't played it, it's a pretty good game. When the main series was leaning towards more action, the Revelation series kind of picked it up and tried to be a bit more atmospheric, be a bit more horror-focused. You're always teamed up with another partner, so it doesn't quite feel as lonesome as those original Resident Evil games, but it was a fun game. The shooting was good, the enemies were interesting, it was a new storyline. Definitely worth checking out. Following that is Destiny 2, which came out for the PS4 and Xbox One. This is the follow-up to the polarizing original Destiny. It's a strange update that's well loved by Destiny fans, but not quite the full experience that I think players were hoping for in a sequel. The game features a new, more focused story that pretty much sidesteps a lot of the lore introduced in the original game. There's also new areas to explore, which is I know what a lot of people were waiting for in the original Destiny, but I think with the recent DLC and stuff, some of that stuff is repeated a bit too often. Overall, the core mechanics are still great, it's just how it's put together is a bit of a mess. And a lot of the changes and controversy that have come up over the last year don't really help it. It's hard to do this game justice because it's pretty polarizing. When it's good, it's really good, but overall it's a fairly inconsistent experience. It's a great shooter, it's just the way it's put together doesn't make it great for everyone. Next up, a game I mentioned in my Switch episode, so I feel like I have to mention it here. Touhou Kabuto V Burst Battle. Now this is a interesting thing just because it is one of the few Touhou games to come out over here physically, and it was a bit cheaper than the other game that came out over here, so it seemed like a good entry point at the time, but I've been corrected that it's not really part of the main Touhou series. It is kind of a fan-made game that was published, which is really interesting because Touhou is a doujin series to begin with, so this is a kind of doujin game from a doujin series. It's pretty confusing. I find the Touhou series confusing in general, but yeah, this is not a typical bullet hell shooter like the other Touhou games. This is a one-on-one arena-based shooter like Virtual On. It's not great, but if you're a huge Touhou fan, it's definitely something you want in your collection. Next up is the Inside and Limbo 2-pack. So this was released on the PS4 and Xbox One. It is a combination of the two indie kind of puzzle platform darlings of the last couple of years, Inside and Limbo. They're both very similar. They have a real kind of out-of-this-world vibe to them, and they're both just really stylish and interesting, so highly recommended. Next up, also for PS4 and Xbox One, Dishonored: Death of the Outsider. This is the third Dishonored game that was originally designed as a DLC expansion to 2, but became its own standalone game. The game finishes off some of the storylines left over from the original Dishonored game to complete this kind of Dishonored trilogy, and wraps up the story surrounding some characters from the first two games. Core gameplay is very similar, but some major changes have been made to make this quite a bit different from the previous games. The game is a stealth action game where the main character can use supernatural abilities. This time the player gets control of all three abilities at once early in the game, so they can utilize them throughout the whole thing instead of having to wait for them to unlock. Other changes involve removing the chaos system, which changed the world, and relying on elixirs for healings. These changes were done to give the player more freedom to explore the environment and use their abilities in interesting ways without having to be punished like the old games did. So if you've played the first two games, you definitely want to check out this one. If you haven't, this one seems a bit more accessible, so it may be a good place to jump in and see if you like the series. Next up, also for PS4 and Xbox One, is Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite, the newest game in the Marvel vs. Capcom series. that changes things up quite a bit for better or worse. So first off, now it is a 2-on-2 fighter instead of the 3-on-3 fighter the last two games have been. There are no more assist buttons, so it doesn't use that traditional system where you can just call in assists from your other characters at any moment. Instead, it uses a more like Street Fighter cross Tekken system where you start a combo with one character and can bring in the other character to kind of continue the combo. The game has taken a ton of flack for not having a lot of the mainstay X-Men characters that people love from the previous games. It introduces a new story mode that is just a silly cinematic story mode like other fighting games are doing, but shows the Capcom characters working together with the Marvel characters in a bunch of ways that it's kind of nonsensical, but it's dumb fun. I like it. Following that, another Capcom game that didn't get enough love last gen. This is the updated version of Dragon's Dogma Dark Arisen, which also comes out on PS4 and Xbox One. So this is an update of a last-gen game, but one that's worth checking out. I don't think a lot of people played it. This is kind of a third-person open-world RPG, but the combat system is way better than the traditional open-world third-person action RPGs are, which makes it something that's a lot funner to play. The storyline isn't great, but it kind of comes together in a really interesting way at the end. Definitely worth checking out if you're into those kinds of RPGs. Next up is Middleearth Shadow of War for the PS4 and Xbox One. I never really got into the original Shadow of Mordor, and all this controversy surrounding this made it easy for me to avoid for now. But yeah, basically this is a follow-up to the original Shadow of Mordor, and it should have been an easy sell by all accounts because that game was highly regarded by fans and critics, and it seemed like it'd be a no-brainer to just expand on those original concepts and make them better and tighter, but instead, this game really went the other direction. So first off, this game is a third-person open-world adventure game like the Assassin's Creed series. What makes this game really stand out, other than its, Middle-earth J.R.R. Tolkien setting, is that the game uses this nemesis system where the orcs that beat you, eventually one will kind of rise up as your nemesis and will hunt you down, and you have this kind of ongoing struggle between you and this one orc, which that's what's in the original game, and so they've expanded that with a ton of new orc types and personalities that are supposed to build that up more. What really does ruin this game is the way that loot boxes are really shoved in here. Along with Forza 7 and Star Wars Battlefront, this game is up there with one of the ones that really pissed off a lot of gamers this year, because while it starts off innocently enough, it just berades you with the option to get loot boxes, and a game eventually just becomes a massive grind to get through to the end. The ending is locked behind a good 20 hours of grinding, forcing you to buy loot boxes if you want to try to get that done a little quicker. It's just something that doesn't really respect the player's time or money, and it's a shame because it's a game that should have been great, that a lot of people say, the first half of it is still pretty good, but knowing that that's what the back half is like, I just can't get interested in it. Next up is The Evil Within 2, which was released for PS4 and Xbox One. This is a follow-up to the original Evil Within, which itself was kind of a spiritual follow-up to Resident Evil 4. It was designed by the creator of Resident Evil 4, Shinji Mikami, and really took that kind of gameplay style into a whole new direction. It is that third-person, over-the-shoulder shooter kind of gameplay. The Evil Within series features some more stealth-based gameplay. The original game was decent, but I don't think it resonated with a lot of players. I think the focus on gore and disturbing imagery over suspense really turned off people, even though the combat and gameplay was pretty good. The sequel seems to have improved on just about everything. The gameplay is similar, but features more open environments, which gives the player more opportunities to approach encounters in different ways. It also features new items and a focus on exploration to help the game feel a bit less linear. With the reveal from the end of the first game, the strange occurrences are making more sense this time around, so it doesn't feel as disjointed as the original game did. Overall, it is still just a game for hardcore horror fans, but if you love Resident Evil 4 and didn't maybe dig the original or did dig the original, this is something worth looking into. Next up for PS4 and Xbox One, South Park: The Fractured Butthole. This is a follow-up to the original South Park Stick of Truth RPG and changes the world from a fantasy theme to a superhero theme. Combat has been completely changed from a traditional turn-based RPG system to a more grid-based tactics system. Like the first game, you can fully explore the town and complete various missions and objectives to kind of unlock new areas and get new items and costumes. The new Kunstagram system has you friending people in order to get your follower count up, and the crafting system lets you build all kinds of things. Collecting costumes is a big part of the game. There's a ton of costume sets out there to dress your character up as. The character management is a lot less like a traditional RPG and more about unlocking slots and equipping certain accessories. The game tells another huge hilarious story with a ton of callbacks to the show, and while it doesn't feel as fresh or as interesting as the original game, it is still worth playing. There's a lot of fun to be had there. Next up for PS4 and Xbox One is Assassin's Creed Origins. This is the game that the Ubisoft teams took a year off to work on, which is great because it breaks that trend of every other Assassin's Creed game being a broken mess. This one is a much more solid experience than you would expect. For the most part, it is still a traditional Assassin's Creed games. They did make a ton of minor changes and a ton of changes to the gameplay that make it feel different enough. There is a lot to love about the game, but there's still some criticisms about it. Some of the more interesting additions are the ability to take control of an eagle to scout areas and to tame animals to fight alongside you. The story takes place in Egypt and covers the origins of the Assassin's Brotherhood. The modern day story continues to take a back seat, and I know I'm in the minority here, but I kind of missed that. I really liked having the through line that connected all the games together and shows you what's happening in the present, instead of just having every game feel like a one-off. The new character is really cool back though, and there's a ton of great stuff to love about this game. Definitely a great jumping in point if you haven't played Assassin's Creed in a couple years. I know a lot of people stopped with 2 or 4, so this is a game that brought a lot of other people back into the series, and let's hope that they can continue this trend moving forward with making new and interesting Assassin's Creed games and not rushing them out like they used to. Next up for PS4 and Xbox One, Wolfenstein 2, The New Colossus. So this is a follow-up to Wolfenstein The New Order, which was a huge success, and basically just continues that trend. The game continues the story of Nazis in America after Germany wins World War II. Like the first game, it is a first-person shooter with the ability to make some choices throughout the campaign, and like the first one, it's highly praised for its storytelling and set pieces, so that's really the draw here. Overall, it's not an amazing first-person shooter, it's just a story that makes it worthwhile. Definitely worth checking out. It's actually kind of frustrating for a first-person shooter, so take it down to easy if you haven't and are getting frustrated with it. You do want to see that story, and I don't think there's any shame in that. Next up is Call of Duty World War II. Now this is Call of Duty's return to its original World War II setting with its traditional single-player campaign, multiplayer modes, and zombie modes. This one is built by the team behind Modern Warfare 3 and Advanced Warfare. The game is pretty well liked by Call of Duty fans. I haven't heard that much buzz about it this year compared to Battlefield 1, but overall, if you're into Call of Duty, this is a game you definitely checked out. Going back to that original setting is something that's a nice change for the series, just to mix up that setting once in a while. They've gone further and further into the future trying to be more interesting, and so it's good for something different. I haven't really kept up with the series for the last couple iterations. I'll get them at some point, so I do hope to get to this one at some point. I'm just not really rushing to play it with all these other amazing games to play. Next up for PS4 and Xbox One again, Walking Dead, the Telltale Collection. So this is something that's great for collectors like me. I love these Telltale series, but I always wait for a bit to see if they're going to come out physically so I don't have to double dip on them, and that's what I did for this one. I didn't download the 3rd season or the Michonne episodes, and they managed to come out on this one disc, and I sold my copies of season 1 and 2 before I picked this up, so I got it for a decent amount. But yeah, this is basically just all the episodes of Walking Dead to date. It includes the first 3 seasons and the 3 Michonne episodes. I can't imagine you don't know about the Telltale adventure games at this point, but if you don't, they are these narrative-driven kind of adventure games where you watch a story and make choices throughout the story, and then you have some like QTE action segments. Really, it's a narrative here. It's basically, if you love the Walking Dead show, these are just more episodes that you get to play through. So great for even like non-gamers to get into. Just one of my favorite Telltale series, definitely worth checking out. So another game in the disappointing category, Sonic Forces. Shamefully, just months after the critical and commercial success of Sonic Mania, Sonic Team pushes out this other 3D Sonic game that doesn't live up to even the expectations it set. It's a real shame because it could have taken this year with Sonic Mania doing so well and refined this thing and made it better, made it worthwhile, but instead, no, they just rush it out again. This is a game that actually should have been decent because it was designed based on Sonic Generations and Sonic Colors and built by that team, and those are 2 great Sonic games. Sonic Colors is a great game, Sonic Generations is a pretty good Sonic game, 2 of the best 3D Sonic games, and this was supposed to be kind of a spiritual follow-up to those, and just no, like it's just not even close. Like Sonic Generations, it takes the classic Sonic 2D levels and the modern Sonic 3D levels and kind of puts them together in one game. This also features a new mode where you build a custom avatar and you can switch between that avatar and Sonic to get through levels, which is kind of a callback to something like Sonic Heroes, but just none of it works well, none of it is designed well. It's a real shame. I'm sure Sonic fans have checked it out because they check out everything, and I think it's worth noting about. It's just surprising that Sega pulled that this year, but yeah, whatever. Sonic Forces. Back-to-back disappointing games. Need for Speed Payback for the PS4 and Xbox One. After the lackluster launch of the Need for Speed reboot a couple years ago, the team took a year off to work on Payback. It had a pretty interesting concept. They were trying to turn it into like a Fast and the Furious kind of thing, so a single-player mode that focused on 3 different characters with different driving skills that go through a number of action movie-like scenes, but it just didn't come together. It didn't really work. It was buggy. The story didn't really deliver on the hype. It's a shame because, as a second bad Need for Speed game in a row, that series had its fans, and it's a shame to see that it's not really going in the direction they would like. Next up is the Noire Remastered for Xbox One, PS4, and Switch. So this is an update to the Rockstar 1950s LA crime noir story. I really didn't like this game. It is a narrative game that features some open world driving segments and some shooting segments. It kind of tries to be like an LA Confidential storyline video game about movie stars in this era, and the game is an open-world detective game where the player drives around LA, investigating crimes and getting into shootouts. The main focus is the interrogation system, where the player must determine if a character is lying or not during interviews. I never really liked that system. For me, I found it ill-conceived. I think this update of the game changes the options to try and make it a little more transparent, but I don't think they really did a good job of that. It's still kind of obscure what you're supposed to choose when. Basically, if you're playing the game, just choose lie anytime someone's eyes shift. But yeah, this game has its fans, and it's worth noting for them. So following that, we get LEGO Marvel Superheroes 2, which, a lot of people get tired of these LEGO games, but everyone is decent and worth noting in its own way. Especially if you're into that particular franchise. Like the previous games, there are a ton of playable characters, each with their own special abilities, and all the traditional puzzles you'd expect from a LEGO game. The game introduces some features to manipulate time and a new 4-player battle mode. So there's not a ton new here, but for fans of the original LEGO Marvel game, definitely worth checking out. Following that, we get Sims 4, so the latest in the Life Sim franchise, finally coming to console. But it looks like the wait was well worth it because the original PC game got some pretty bad reviews at launch. There was just a ton missing, a ton of stuff that was in Sim 3s that they didn't have in this one. And they've added all that stuff in, a ton of stuff in. And now with the console launch, that has everything in there. So definitely worth waiting to get this kind of more complete version than getting a kind of half-baked version last year. Next up, the controversy of the year, Star Wars Battlefront 2. Just get the controversy stuff out of the way. If you haven't been following it, the loot boxes really kind of destroyed this game. I mean, they've been changing it and tweaking it all the way up to launch and past launch, but the game was really designed around these loot boxes for progression. So in a game that is focused on multiplayer combat, you could get an edge over your other players by buying loot boxes, and it also enticed you to spend money in a way that no other game really had to that point. So there's been a couple of games this year that have been really bad for loot boxes, but I think this was the worst and really pushed it over the edge. So it took a ton of flack for that at launch. That said, it is basically what you'd expect from a Battlefront sequel. It's gotten all the stuff from the original Battlefront. It takes that original Battlefront formula, which still doesn't hold up to the original games. It really does feel more like a Star Wars Battlefield, but this one introduces space battles now, and it has a single-player campaign mode that is not great, but it's the reason I checked it out, and an interesting side story set in the Star Wars world. Next up is Space Hulk Deathwing, which came out on the PS4 and Xbox One. And this game is worth mentioning only because of its series and because the original game had a cult following. Deathwing is the latest Space Hulk game that takes place in the Warhammer 40k universe. This time it's an FPS instead of a traditional turn-based strategy game. The game has a single-player campaign and multiplayer mode, really just for fans of Warhammer 40k. And the last game released for PS4 and Xbox One, Okami HD, which is an update of the original PS2 and later Wii game. This is an action-adventure game that people should check out just for the style. It is a beautifully rendered, cel-shaded, watercolor world. You play as the White Wolf Sun God, Amatsuru, who moves and attacks like a wolf, but is also equipped with the Celestial Paintbrush, which can be used to draw different shapes, and that can help in combat and to solve different puzzles. So this game is heavily inspired by Zelda Wind Waker, and so if you're into Zelda games and looking for something more like that, definitely worth checking out. Just for the art style alone, it's a beautiful game. I highly recommend it. And that's it for my multi-platform episode. Thanks for checking it out. This kind of finishes off those first 3 main consoles. Like I said earlier, I'm going to get to Vita and 3DS next, and then I'm getting back to my classic stuff. So stay tuned for that stuff. I have no idea when I'll get to the digital stuff. It's pretty tough because there's so much released every year, and I just can't keep up with all that stuff. But I do hope to get to it sometime. Leave any comments for any physical games that I maybe didn't mention that are great, because for as much research as I can do, sometimes I miss out on stuff and I want to know about that stuff to check out. So I'll see you guys next time.